This is Your Anxiety Toolkit, episode number 103. Welcome to Your Anxiety Toolkit. I'm your host, Kimberly Quinlan. This podcast is fueled by three main goals. The first goal is to provide you with some extra tools to help you manage your anxiety. Second goal, to inspire you. Anxiety doesn't get to decide how you live your life. And number three, and I leave the best for last, is to provide you with one big, fat virtual hug. Because experiencing anxiety ain't easy. If that sounds good to you, let's go. Okay, so I'm so excited to share this episode with you. I just finished recording with Ethan Smith. He's been on before, but if you've listened to that episode, and I really do encourage you to go back and listen to that episode first, then come back here and consider this the second chapter of this really incredible story about the practice and journey of self-compassion. Now, the reason I love this episode so much is because Ethan tells a story in this really raw and vulnerable way of the journey of self-compassion and how he wrestled with it and some of the breakthroughs he had with the practice of self-compassion. He talks about the roadblocks he had, some of the incorrect thoughts that he had, the struggles and issues that arose that was preventing him from really holding gentle space for himself. And it was just such a beautiful episode. And I do encourage you guys just to sit back and fully embrace and savor this journey that he takes us on of his experience with negative self-talk and stigma and pride and falling down and making mistakes and feeling like a failure. And oh my gosh, I just loved this episode so much. And even for hours after recording it, I kept welling up with emotion and at gratitude that I get to have these conversations with people. I'm so, so grateful that I can have these real, raw, and vulnerable conversations and share them with you guys so that you guys can listen and I think probably see yourself in this story, as I did immensely. So sit back and enjoy. This is a story about a journey through and around self-compassion. It's beautiful. So I hope you enjoy it. Well, welcome. I am so happy to have you with me again, Ethan Smith.
Kim Quinlan, I'm so excited to be here.
I know. It's so fun that your last name is Smith because that was my last name too.
Oh, was it? Was it your maiden name?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I didn't know that. Maybe we're cousins.
We probably are. Very long, long cousins.
Yeah, I'm just missing the blonde hair and the Australian accent. Yeah.
I am so happy to have this conversation with you. We've had an episode before where you beautifully told pieces of your story. And then Ethan reached out to me to say, let's do the next chapter. Let's talk about this newer journey that you're on, that I think we're all on. And I'm so excited to do this because I think that it's something that we don't really highlight enough, which is sort of the journey of practicing self-compassion and what comes up that causes roadblocks with that. So I'd love just to get, tell me a little bit about what it is that happened in this second piece of the journey for you.
Yeah, I think that there's the OCD journey, and I talk a lot about that. And then I talk about, living in maintenance and life is great. And I have my ups and downs, and I definitely struggle with anxiety and OCD. But, overall, I'm doing very well. And that was definitely put to the test this last year, probably more so than it had been since I was really ill, maybe in 2011. And I think that, again, much like our descent into darkness, it was a perfect storm of events. I think that's a common pattern that we see, or that I see in my own journey when, it really hits the fan. So, I think it started with a few things. I think that for me, life, I can't complain. I've learned in the past, few years that it's not so much about attaining, total freedom from OCD or total freedom from anxiety. It's really about having more good days than bad. And if you can have, more good days than bad, that you're winning, because you're going to have bad days. You just are. And so if I can lessen the amount of bad and increase the amount of good, then I'm ahead of the game. And I definitely would say that I've had that over the last 7 or 8 years, and I'm insanely blessed too. But at the beginning of last year, there were a few things that were going on, and not directly related to OCD per se. In fact, this whole story isn't really about OCD. OCD played a very minimal role in all of this. But there were a few things that happened. The first thing was I turned 40, and I really struggled with turning 40 last year. I struggled with it because I always saw myself at a certain place, doing certain things, being a certain way, living a certain life. And I don't think that's unique to anyone, with a mental illness or not. I think we all think we're going to be somewhere at a certain time. We all feel like maybe we're not there yet, or whatever the case may be. I personally am really hard on myself about that because I feel like I lost so many years with OCD. So I struggle an insane amount with feeling like I have to catch up and feeling like I have to make up for lost time. And, it's one thing to make up for a few days, but I feel like I have to make up for 20 years, and catch back up to where I should be at 40 had I not had OCD, which, it's constantly pointed out. You don't know where you'd been, you could have been hit by a bus or whatever. But in your mind, you have this sort of perfect trajectory if you didn't have these obstacles. And so turning 40 was a really hard one for me. I normally don't like my birthdays. They're very stressful for me for some reason. I never like my birthdays, but this one was difficult. In addition to the fact that I was going through a lot of financial issues, mostly because of paying for mental health. And it had put me, over the course of 7, 8 years, yes, I've made a decent living, but, I've also been put a lot of eggs in my baskets in terms of like making movies and really succeeding in the industry. And I've had a lot of successes, but I haven't had that big success yet. And so, full disclosure, I've been, mostly just charging, therapy and drugs and everything else that it takes to stay in maintenance on credit cards and paying them down where I could. But over the course of 7 or 8 years of trying to figure it all out, and, it adds up. It gets to be a lot. And so, I turned 40 and I'm struggling financially. And then if I look at the relationship side of things, I've dated and I've had some relationships in the last 7 years, but I'm single. And I love kids, and I always imagined myself being married and having children and being an amazing dad. And, that hasn't happened yet. So now I'm looking at myself and I'm turning 40 and I'm financially struggling and I'm single and I don't have a relationship, and I feel very alone a lot of times, and I feel a lot of loneliness living alone. And, I have amazing friends, and I think we can all relate to those feelings of despair. In times where, yes, you have a lot of people in your life, but it doesn't matter. You feel alone in your pain, so to speak. And I think the final sort of blow was I've been trying to make these movies for the past 3 years, and I don't think I've ever given my all to something more than I've given these projects. For 3 years straight, I'd pretty much exhausted every resource, all of my energy, gone out of the box creatively, business-wise. I mean, it's hard to put into words, but no regrets. Let's put it that way in terms of, making these projects. I mean, I could not have given more to myself. But in doing that, I learned, and I don't want to turn this so negative, but, at least I grew up with parents that, said, if you put your mind to it, you can accomplish anything. And that very well may be true. I'm still in the process of making these films, but as I was hitting more and more roadblocks, I was like, gee, I really gave all I had to this and it didn't happen. And it felt like the most monumental failure. And I think that it felt like the most monumental failure because, yes, I've had ups and downs. And when I was acting, I didn't get parts and I did get parts. But this was really the first time in my career where I wasn't able to achieve what I thought I would be able to achieve in the time I thought I would be able to achieve it. And I didn't have the mental illness to blame. So I didn't have OCD to blame. And that probably was the hardest thing for me because I didn't have OCD to blame, if I didn't have a mental illness to blame, or if my hands weren't tied behind my back, or if I didn't have that secondary gain of being able to blame something else, then I had no one to blame but myself. And regardless of how much was in or out of my control, which in this business so little is in my control, doesn't matter. In my mind, I should have been smart enough. I should have been creative enough. I should have been able to overcome everything and make it happen. And that's not realistic, but in my brain, the assumption had always been, once I got better, sky's the limit. Life should be easy. And life is really hard. Life is really hard. And life is even harder with OCD or any anxiety or any mental illness, because you have an extra layer of weight holding you down that you kind of have to get up with every day. So I think those combinations of things, the last thing I'll say is I felt like I was also doing everything right. Like I was working out, I'd lost 40 pounds, I was eating extremely healthy. And so then it becomes, well, if I'm doing everything right and things aren't going right, then what's wrong with me? It becomes very black and white and tunnel. But when you're in it, now I can look back and go, that's ridiculous. But when you're in it, that's the reality. So I think those combinations of things, which are all real life things, people try to achieve goals, people are dating and single or not, people go through financial ups and downs. Those are all real life things. None of those things are specific to a mental illness. They're specific to humanity, and being human in this day and age in the US as adults. So that's what was happening, and I wasn't prepared for it. And I think I wasn't prepared for it because of the OCD and the anxiety and sort of what it shielded me from, and the ability to blame it for everything, for any failures that I had or not successes or, anything that didn't go my way. I always had that to blame. And over the last 8 years, when I've been sort of living my best life, yes, I've had those instances, but this was the first, probably biggest thing that I tried to achieve that I just didn't get there. And anyway, so.
Let's zoom in on that. What did it feel like? So I think we've all had something similar, but I'd love to get your experience of, you said at the beginning, there was a perfect storm of events that happened that kind of crashed down in what we talked about in our last episode. But now there wasn't that storm, and you were doing everything right, and you were working so hard. And it's so great to hear that story, because it shows how far you've come. But what was it like to feel that? What would you say? Did you feel like it was a failure? Did you feel like it was a mistake? What was that like for you?
It was really turning the mirror on myself and turning the lens on myself. I felt very raw and very naked and very vulnerable. I felt like, all the layers of the onion had been peeled away, and what was left was just Ethan. And really, the perfect storm sort of became the outcome of all of these things. So I was doing everything right, but then suddenly the epiphanies started happening, and there was this chain event of turning 40 and being single and struggling financially and not succeeding in the way I thought I should have or was going to. And also, to add to it, I was hiking and I turned my ankle really bad and almost broke the ankle. And so I was physically hurt for a few months. I ended up not breaking it, but it was a severe sprain. And that sounds like nothing, but then I wasn't able to exercise, and I started. And so I think it was the first time, Kim, it's really hard to describe, because I was about to say it's the first time life dealt me a blow, but that's not true. I've had deaths, I've had that. But I feel like all of those other things were external, things that happened to me or happened in my life that I reacted to, like the death of my grandmother, the death of my grandfather. This felt like a direct assault on Ethan, on who I thought I was versus who I really was, which, as all of these life things permeated my brain and really, really hit me, it became a conversation of, I have nothing to blame but myself for all of these circumstances. I wasn't able to overcome the obstacles that were laid in front of me. I wasn't able to catch back up from the OCD and anxiety. And all of that equaled a very simple thought, which was, Ethan is not enough, or Ethan is less than. And that thought I believed with all my heart. And it broke me. It really broke me. And it made my thinking so black and white that it was almost like a math problem where, well, if I'm doing everything right and trying as hard as I can and it's not paying off, then what's the point? And that if then it's out of my control, and what's the point? And it then led to some pretty destructive behavior on my part because I kind of gave up. And I wasn't suicidal. I wasn't that kind of thing. It was more like, F it. I'm just going to do what I want when I want, because who gives a crap? And clearly living life and being good isn't enough to get what you want. So screw it. F it all.
Right. How long were you in that place? Like, I think I know I've felt that feeling, and I'm curious to know how many other people have, but how long was that experience for you? How long were you in that place?
It was a bit, and there was a few components to it, Kim. I think that, wow, this is hard to talk about. Anyway, I was in that place for quite a while. I remember what I was going to say. Something that also came up for this is I think I hold myself to an impossible standard, and I think a lot of us do. I think we all, for perfectionistic or whatever the case may be, I think we hold ourselves to a higher standard. And something that I learned in this process was that I definitely felt like because I'm an advocate or I speak publicly that I wasn't allowed to struggle myself. And I kind of always knew that I'm not allowed to struggle or have ups and downs. I always had that thinking in my head, but I didn't realize how much I subscribed to it until now. And I mean, which also made me feel like an imposter, because I always talk about, oh yeah, no, it's fine. Everybody has ups and downs. And I say that all the time. I always talk about, OCD is a roller coaster, and so is so many other mental illnesses. And it's like MS, and you're going to have good days and bad days. And I say that to everyone, and I mean it. But like, I didn't realize how much I subscribed to, yeah, but that doesn't pertain to me. And the other thing was, this term common humanity, which you use a lot, which is just being able to, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's just, being able to relate to everyone. Everybody goes through. I didn't understand it because I'm like, yeah, but I'm me. And I should be able to I had some sort of, as insecure as I typically am as a person, I had some sort of like grander, lofty thoughts that those rules didn't apply to Ethan. Because if Ethan didn't have OCD and have anything holding him back, then I should be able to achieve everything that I want. So to go back to your question, it probably that period of time for about a month and a half. And I was engaging in some pretty destructive behavior for me. And as I talk about a lot, I'm always, in therapy. I haven't stopped therapy since, I go at least once a week for 8 years. I'm on medication. I go see my psychiatrist once a week. But I was kind of minimizing what was happening to them, which was kind of the first time I'd done that. I wouldn't say I was lying, but I would say I was minimizing it, because in my mind, it's just like, what was the point, But I started to hit a place where I couldn't really hide what I was doing, and it was starting to really affect my life. And so my therapist and my psychiatrist was like, yeah, something's definitely up, and we need to, take care of this. And so I was in that sort of really destructive place, maybe for 2 months before, my team, so to speak, got wind of it and really saw the seriousness of it. And I kind of got a new diagnosis in this process, which with OCD, when you get diagnosed and you don't know what's been going on, it's alleviating. In this situation, this was disheartening, and I felt even more broken. So like, I've always erred on the hypomanic side of things. I've always run hot, and I think a lot of creative people do. That's how we get in the zone. That's how we, and up to this point, it hadn't impacted me in a destructive or negative way. I'm sure there were periods of time where I felt very, high or whatever, but at this point it was having, the hypomania was dialed in, and it was hot, and it was just, I was going. And like, to hear, hey, listen, Ethan, we've always felt like you're on this edge. It wasn't a formal bipolar diagnosis, or if it was, I don't know if it was or not. I'm not big into labels and diagnosis. I think that we all have what I like to call combo meals. I have my main course and then 3 sides. But regardless, they were like, my team was like, look, you're in a very, serious hypomanic state, and you need to get on something to kind of break that. And man, Kim, that crushed me. Because I had so much pride in, I've been well for so long. I haven't been on a new medication for so long. I've been getting off. And like so much of my self-worth was tied to my mental health. But that's a false statement because it wasn't tied to my mental health. It was tied to the belief that I could stay mentally healthy. And that was a win, and that I wasn't allowed to be not mentally healthy. And so they started me on some medication, and this was like sort of the next bit in this journey. So first there was the stuff that led to the fall, so to speak, and then there was the fall itself and coping in a destructive way as opposed to positive coping. But then, kind of shaking anyway. But then they introduced new medication, and I think, anyone listening that has been through OCD or anxiety or whatever it is, we all have had this like love-hate relationship with medication where, yes, it's beneficial and it helps. And at the same time, we all feel like lab rats because, we got to test things and we don't know if it's going to work or not. And let's go up, let's go down, let's go this, let's go that. And I had forgotten that feeling. And the first time I was sitting in my bathroom, and the first time I took the new pill, I was bawling because I felt like I had failed myself. Which is something that I talk about all the time. Like, I mean, that's the epitome of stigma, is like, I'm weak. Why do I have to take this medication? When it's a disorder, it's a disease. And like, I know that logically, and buy into everything that I tell people not to buy into. And I mean, I just bawled. I was just like, I'm a failure. I'm weak. I'm a piece of crap. I've let everyone down. I've let myself down. Anyway, needless to say, I went on, over the course of probably 2 months, I went on 3 different medications. And what was happening at the time was, because they needed to break that hypomania, I ended up on something very strong to sort of just kind of, I call it like punch me in the face. Sometimes you just got to be slapped, to come back around. But what was scary was that the medication really muted my creativity and my ability to multitask. And it scared the crap out of me, because what I had relied on so long for the last 7 years to be able to succeed in business or in creativity or whatever, I didn't have access to it. And so it's like, it's that gift, it's that curse. Like, there's so many geniuses that are so close to, and it's that, I hate to use the word crazy, but it's that, whatever, it's, it's good, it's bad, it's the gift, it's the curse. So anyway, so the next phase of this was, I was unable to work. I wouldn't say zombied out, but I was definitely knocked on my butt. Like, I was, it was hard to function, but it was kind of necessary. In retrospect, it was necessary to sort of get me out of this. But, here I was now, and instead of going like, wow, I'm going to get better, this was just insult to injury. This was like, I'm 40, I'm single, I'm in financial trouble, I couldn't achieve my goals, and now I'm on more medication because there's a new mental illness. When really it was always there. But in my mind, it was a new mental illness with a new label that now needed to be addressed. And like, how am I ever going to achieve any of these things or get anywhere in life if now I've got stuff added to the pile? So that's kind of, that's kind of where I found myself. And to be honest with you, even with the therapy and the medication, I think that was a lower point than the rest of it, just because of the extra layer.
I really resonate with what you're saying as a therapist, because I preach all day that it's, we've got to break the stigma, and it's okay to have rough days, and it's fine to go on medication, and everybody panics. And I actually I've had a very similar experience in the last few months of having a difficult time and having this internal dialogue of like, but I'm an anxiety specialist, and that should somehow protect me from having a difficult time. It's funny. I resonate with what you're saying, because, you think you're enlightened, and then I'm really not, you know what I mean? And then you have to work through, you have to, sit on the floor and cry and put the pill in your mouth and swallow your pride kind of thing, I think is what it is. So I really resonate with what you're saying here, because it's actually meeting yourself on that moment when you're on the floor crying, accepting this new thing.
And I think, however, I'll add to that, and you may be able to relate to this too, that I think either subconsciously or even consciously, if you've already been through some sort of struggle, deep down, there's a silver lining in all of this, and I think that ultimately, whether I knew that consciously or subconsciously, I knew at some point there would be a silver lining that would appear and I'll be stronger for it. It's something that I didn't know going through sort of my OCD trials and tribulations, and that I learned after the fact, but it's something that I hold tight to now when I'm going through anything tough, is that I've yet to go through an experience that's been difficult or rocky or whatever, where there hasn't been a silver lining and where I haven't learned something or taken away something or become stronger for it. And so I think at some level I knew that. And I think honestly that spark really kept me from going even deeper or, to a much darker place.
Tell me about how common humanity impacted you. So common humanity is a component of self-compassion. What role, I know you mentioned it, what role did that play in this journey of yours?
The self-compassion component for me was the key coming out of this. And it was something, I think on the surface, we kind of all know what self-compassion is. And, we may think we practice it or not. I always considered myself someone who loved myself and cared about myself and, wanted to take care of myself and wanted the best for me. Even better than the real medication that I needed for all of this was self-compassion. And in the journey to follow, which was probably November, December, January of this last year, or of this year, January of this year, which was really the aftermath of all of this was really difficult too, because I hadn't worked for months and I had to make a lot of really difficult decisions. I learned, or I realized, and I can't emphasize this enough, let me backtrack. I think that if I look back, I go, the incident feels more like a blip than it does like a chunk of my life. And I think that's because of, not to toot my own horn or whatever, but I think I always know to attack whatever these mental things are full force, like with the psychologist, with the psychiatrist, with whatever. And yes, I struggle with the medication and everything, but one thing I've done consistently, I haven't worked out consistently. I haven't eaten healthy consistently in 9 years. One thing I've done consistently is gone to therapy every week, at least once a week. So I credit that and engaging and taking proactive steps, because knowing how dark things can get is, for me, a real motivator and not wanting to go there. And even as dark as I was during that time, from my previous experiences, I knew how much worse it could get, and I just wasn't willing to go there. But the self-compassion aspect for me was a major revelation and realization. And I didn't realize up to this point how negative my self-talk was. Not only during this period of time, but really this whole time. For the last 7 or 8 years, I held myself to impossible standards. And if I spoke to a friend the way I spoke to myself, I wouldn't have any friends. And my inner narrative, my inner voice, and what I constantly bought into, I read a really good book, and it was talking about how, if your inner voice was a salesman on the outside, what a crappy salesman it would be. And yet everything my inner narrative said to me, I bought in hook, line, and sinker. I was just like, yes, you're right. I am all of these things. No, I mean, every single time, no matter how many times I proved it wrong, no matter how many times it was false information, I was just like, yes, you're right. I'm all of those things. And so the discovery of self-compassion and common humanity was easily the biggest revelation in my life. But I will say that it was something that I fought very hard against. I felt less because I felt inadequate. I also felt like that I didn't deserve self-compassion. And I didn't understand also how I could succeed being compassionate toward myself, because in my mind, you have to be hard on yourself in order to move forward and succeed. So in the very beginning stages of learning sort of self-compassion and what it is and how to talk to yourself, and I would constantly argue with my therapist. Not only did I not deserve it, not only was it super uncomfortable and felt really selfish, but that it was wrong, that I was better, that I was smarter than it, I knew better. And, my constant analogy was, does a basketball coach in the playoffs go into the locker room at halftime when their team is losing and go, I would just feel good about where are today and not be judgmental. Don't judge yourselves. Don't judge where you are. Just accept where you are, be mindful, and let that be okay. Like, is that the speech in a law room, And no, it's not. It's like, get your asses out there and like, in my mind, that had to be my self-talk all the time in order for me to succeed. So the whole self-compassion, common humanity, mindfulness, even though I feel very well versed in ACT and DBT, all of those things, it didn't feel right. It didn't feel like the path. It didn't feel like the answer. It didn't feel like anything. It felt wrong, and I didn't understand it logically, and I didn't feel deserving of it. And so diving into that at the very beginning stages was really difficult for me.
It goes against this whole idea of productivity, right? Like, if you want something hard enough, you'll work towards it. And so I think we buy into that at an early age of like, it must be hard work and it must be brutal and it must be sweaty, and self-compassion is not that, right?
No, exactly. And I kept turning to the coach analogy and telling my therapist, that doesn't make sense because I need to, she made a good point too. She's like, okay, but are those, basketball players, if you will, doing the destructive crap that you're doing? Like, it's all relative to the mental illness. And it's like, yeah, non-alcoholics drink, but, if you're an alcoholic, you can't drink. And so, it's like, if you beat the crap out of yourself to the point of it negatively impacting your life and you're engaging in negative coping skills and mechanisms, like, maybe beating the crap out of yourself isn't the best thing for you at this time right now.
Exactly.
Maybe we need to let go of some of this productivity in order to introduce some self-compassion to get you to a better place. And then maybe you can kick yourself in the ass a little bit, but it's all relative to where you are. And that was very enlightening for me.
And I think it's a good thing to remember when you're on the bathroom floor crying, is that's not the time to give yourself a coach yell, right?
Yeah, no, it isn't. It isn't at all. It's the time to, really love yourself. And, judgmental is the word that come to mind. I mean, that's such a strong word. And I think that I took a Myers-Briggs personality test the other day. I'd never taken it. And I'm an INFJ, which, I'm definitely, as I've gotten older, become an extroverted introvert. Like, I'm comfortable in front of people, but like, at the same time, but the judgy part at the end is definitely true. I was like spot on. I judge the living crap out of myself in every single thing that I do. And so being non-judgmental, saying non-judgmental things to myself, making observations without judgment and wording them in a way that aren't judgmental is so foreign to me. It's so not natural. I think it's difficult for anyone. I think we all, are ashamed, and guilt and all of those things are the opposite of self-compassion. But it really felt like learning Japanese. It was a totally foreign language, and it wasn't an easy foreign language. It was something that I couldn't pick up right away. So it was almost like first going to ERP for the first time. And, before engaging in ERP, you really need to have that willingness for change. And there's all kinds of exercises and things you can do to increase your willingness for change. And I feel like that was very applicable here. I didn't feel deserving of self-compassion. And so, I needed to get to a place where then I could accept the self-compassion, so to speak, and accept those modalities of treatment and understanding and self-reflection before I could start to absorb them.
It's funny because with ERP, usually when someone comes into my office, I have to unteach them everything that they thought was real and have them go in the complete other direction, right? So instead of running away from fear, I'm like, no, we're going to stare it down. But you kind of would have to do that same thing, which is like, you've been going this direction and you actually have to turn the complete other direction. And that's a punch in the face. It really can be.
Yeah, it totally was.
Can you give me an example? I'm putting you on the spot, but can you give me an example of what you once would have said to yourself and now how you would say it in your new language?
That's a great question, and I will answer that question. I just want to preface by saying I am so far away from mastery of self-compassion. I've been actively doing doing workbooks with my therapist and reading books on it since I think November, December of last year. And, we're halfway through the workbook. It's a 200-page workbook that we've been working on weekly. And I'm on page 64. I mean, that's the absolute truth. it's hard. I mean, I am, all I can equate it to is ERP, and like, it's unlearning behavior, it's unlearning self-talk, it's unlearning habit, it's habit reversal, and as resistant as I was to ERP and all the modalities of treatment regarding my OCD, because I had reinforced the OCD thinking for so long, this is exactly the same thing. I've reinforced this negative speak. I've reinforced this judgmental speak. I've reinforced this belief of my own expectations that, this is a very incremental process. And I constantly have to correct myself in my own thinking and thoughts and inner dialogue, because I default to judgment. I default automatically. Like, I'm very fluent in that language. I speak it well. It's my love language. So I think that, first of all, you definitely put me on the spot. That's a hard question to answer. And I think I could answer it specifically and say, yes, I'll reframe or rephrase a sentence instead of saying, if I do something I don't like, or I mess up, or I don't get something I want, instead of saying like, wow, I hate myself, or I'm less than, or, I suck, I'm uncomfortable with what just happened. I acknowledge that I'm experiencing discomfort in this moment and it didn't go my way, and that's okay. That's definitely the things that, I'm working on saying, and I'm so far from being fluent in that. But I think those are the sort of concrete lessons that self-compassion teaches you. And I don't know if this is something that can be taught. I don't know if it was a revelation for myself, but in the last 2 or 3 months, I've made some really tough decisions in an effort to take care of myself. And some decisions may outwardly, or at least seemingly, seem backwards or moving backwards in some respects in my life. And they're not. And I don't think most people that I talk to, close friends, would say, oh my God, no. But in my mind, I think we all kind of have to take a step back to move forward. And in sort of removing myself from certain situations and trying to determine what's healthy for me and how to live my life, something has happened that I wasn't expecting. And it's probably the biggest motivator, is the right word. It's probably the biggest influence in this process, which is I'm starting to become comfortable and accept where I am right now in my life. And that's something I've never been able to do since getting better. Specifically, the age I am and where I am in comparison to other people. Over the last few months, I've really started to be okay with where I am and understand that, I can't go back. And I know that's such an obvious thing. Of course, you can't go back, but we hold on to it. We hold on to, it's easy to live in the past. It's the what if. And I think the acceptance of, I am 41. I am single. I am going through some stuff. It's come, since then, things are definitely like, I'm off the medication. Things are getting better again. Like, the cycle is going back. But I think that the biggest lesson for me in all of this was, or currently is, just accepting who I am and where I am, and being okay with that. And it doesn't mean that I like it all the time, or, but it's just sort of this acceptance that, for me personally, I felt like I lost my teens and my 20s to OCD and anxiety. So I've spent my 30s trying to catch up. I've spent my 30s trying to pack in everything that you do in that period of time, now. And what I've come to realize is really my 30s was basically my teens and my 20s, right? I made good decisions. I made terrible decisions. I did really amazing things. I did really terrible things. Not terrible, illegal, but I just mean, like, my God, anyway. And I think even just months ago, that would have torn me up. And it did tear me up for years, that I was living my 20s and my 30s. It killed me because I want to meet a girl. Like, relationship wise, I have the perfect scenario. I want to meet a girl. I want to fall in love. I want to date for a few years. I want to get married. I want to get engaged. I want to go through the engagement thing. I want to get married, maybe married for 2 or 3 years, and then have a kid. Well, currently I'll be 64 at that point, and really throughout all of this, the biggest lesson is, you know what? I have to let go of all of those expectations. I have to because that's not my reality. And as much as I want it to be my reality, it's just not. And I can't make it my reality. And so what is my reality? And what does that look like moving forward? And that's been the biggest lesson in all this. And I think all of that has come from the self-compassion and the taking care of myself. And like, that's come from all of the work that I've been doing. But it's the biggest lesson for me because I'm slowly becoming okay with, maybe I'd love to have children and meet the love of my life, but maybe it won't happen. I don't have certainty. And I have to be okay with that, or maybe I won't make it to the place in the career that I want to be, being in LA and being 41 when everybody else is 20 and coming out for the first time. And I couldn't do that because of my OCD and trying to, that's just not my reality. I am 41 and I'm in Los Angeles trying to make it in the film business. That's my reality. Let go of, so for me, that's been the biggest lesson, but it's been so freeing. And I think it's the true path to loving myself again.
I think you're right. I think you're on the right track.
Thank you. It's a minute by minute process. And, and with this one, I'm okay not doing it perfectly,
I'm so appreciate you for sharing that really vulnerable process because, I'm seeing myself in you right now. I'm sure the listeners are seeing themselves in you in this story. I think it's so much a part of the human condition. Like you said, the common humanity. Like I think we all are sitting here nodding our head going, yep, I feel you.
And that's what's important when you come from this OCD world or this anxiety world or this mental health world. We put so much weight on it's those things that are holding us down or giving us. And this was all life stuff. This was life. And I didn't realize how unprepared I was for life, being dumped into life later in life after getting over all of these other hurdles. And that's pretty much the takeaway for me is that, this isn't a story about OCD derailing my life. And this really isn't a story about mental illness derailing my life. This is a story about life derailing my life and how to deal and cope with life and how unready I was for it. And because of my past and my history. But again, like I'm experiencing the silver linings of, that I thought I would, just a few months ago. And of course they're beautiful and amazing. And I'm realizing, how strong and all the good things there are. But that's what I think ultimately, I don't know about everybody. I had an expectation of what life would be like without OCD. I was dead wrong. Life is hard. Life is not for the weak. It's super tricky. It's super complicated. It is for anyone. You don't need a mental illness. Life is hard. Life is really, really hard. And I really, truly believe with every fiber of my being that after I got better from OCD, that life would be easy for me. I really believe that. And in retrospect, that seems ridiculous, but I absolutely did. And I think that set me up for a huge, rude awakening, which I got. But I'm grateful, I am where I am. So
thank you so much for sharing this story.
Thank you, Kim Quinlan. I appreciate you so much. And I appreciate everything that you do for the community and how much you put yourself out there. You're definitely an inspiration to so many and become a huge inspiration for me as well.
Thank you. I feel like we dropped into some of the discussion on self-compassion that we haven't dropped into yet. The depth and the practice and the raw vulnerability of that. So thank you.
It's important, I don't want one of the biggest things for me as a sort of a national advocate, so to speak, is I always worry that telling the story and letting people know it's not a perfect path and it's not a perfect, road. It was so important to me. So thank you for giving me the platform to do that.
Thank you for trusting me with it. I really love that you did. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim.
Please note that this podcast or any other resources from cbtschool.com should not replace professional mental health care. If you feel you would benefit, please reach out to a provider in your area. Have a wonderful day and thank you for supporting cbtschool.com.